So please put your hands together for Anjana.
OSCAFEST! Papa now! Woo! What up, Legos? How's everybody doing? Wait, I'm sorry? Hi, there?
We are good!
Can we take a moment to give a huge shout out to the amazing talks from yesterday and from this morning? Yeah, make some noise. It has been so great being here. I'm so excited to be back for my second time in Lagos, to be attending OSCAFEST for my first time. So amazing. And I think we have all been talking about this the whole time, but what I want to talk with you about today is opening doors with open source. So I'm Anjana Vakil. I am a developer advocate at a company called Hasura, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And I am just really excited to be with a huge room full of people excited about open source because of the opportunities it creates, right? Because the future is opening doors, creating new opportunities, right? Building new possibilities. We've been talking a lot about your career, and that's one level I want to talk about building possibilities for. I also want to talk about how you can build new opportunities with open source for your company, whether you work there or you founded a company like so many people did here. And also for the community, which is what it's all about, right? We're here for the community. We're here building a community and creating new opportunities. So I want to talk with you about building opportunities and opening doors for these three levels. So first of all, for your career, and we've been talking about this quite a lot already. There have been some amazing talks about how people have built careers with open source, some of the opportunities that you can follow to do similar things and create new possibilities for yourself. And I think we should do like a little show of hands right now. Raise your hand if you work professionally in the field of tech, in whatever role, any role. Okay, lots of hands, quite a few hands. Okay, now keep your hand up, or raise it again, if you started out with open source software before you worked professionally. A few hands, right? So my hand is up because I definitely did. A little bit about me. So like I said, I am a developer advocate. And before I was a developer advocate, and also at the same time, am a software engineer. So I got into developer advocacy through software engineering. But as in the amazing dramatic reading of my bio, as you heard, I at one point was not in tech at all. I was an English teacher many years ago. I was not doing computers at all for my job. So what happened in the middle there? Like, how did I get a foot in the door in the tech industry? Because it is hard, right? It is challenging to get started in the tech industry. It's competitive. There's a lot of question marks. You're not really sure where to begin. So how did it work for me? Well, in about 2015, I discovered this amazing community called the Recurse Center. Has anybody heard of the Recurse Center? A couple people? Cool, awesome. So if you haven't heard of the Recurse Center, you can read all about it at recurse.com. But this is a programming community based in New York City that runs a programming retreat. It's like a writer's retreat where you go away to work on your craft, but it's for coders, it's for programming. And when you're there, they used to do it in person in New York City. Now it's all online, and people from all over the world are there. When you're there, you work on open source technology. So you're maybe contributing to open source, you're maybe reading about open source, you're maybe learning from open source tools. And while I was there at the Recurse Center, I found out about an amazing program I think we all know by this point, Outreachy. Woo! Who was at the Outreachy talk yesterday from Love and yeah. And everyone, so thank you so much, ladies, for doing the Outreachy overview yesterday. So I don't have to talk too much about it because you heard about it. If you didn't see the talk, go back and watch it. And so in 2016, I did an internship through Outreachy at Mozilla. So this is me and the Firefox in 2016. Aren't we so cute? Okay, And so while I was there, I had my first professional experience in the software industry. And from there, I was able to get my first real full-time job in the software industry. And then I got another, and another, and another, and here we are today. And I am able to have the amazing opportunity to be here talking to all of you, nerding out about functional programming or JavaScript or open source or whatever else. But it wasn't, it wasn't all smooth sailing. It wasn't all perfect as a journey, right? Because nobody has 100% success all the time. Raise your hand if you've been 100% successful every day of your life. Nobody, right? Raise your hand if you've had some failures. I have. Exactly, we all have, yeah. But that's okay, because sometimes that is where the doors open as well, right? And so what I experienced with Outreachy is that actually the first time in 2015 I applied to Outreachy, I did not get in. I was rejected. But that was a really good learning experience for me, because even though I got rejected, I learned how to use GitHub, how to engage with contributors on GitHub in discussions, in pull requests, right? How to use IRC. Anybody use IRC? Chat client? Yeah. I learned how to use it. It was very intimidating for me at the time. I learned how to communicate with open source project maintainers. I learned how to ask better questions. I learned how to articulate what I was contributing better. And so even though I failed in my first attempt, 6 months later, because Outreachy does 2 rounds of internships per year, 6 months later, I tried again, and I was accepted because of all the experience I had gained through my failure the first time. And so I wrote a lot about that on my very old blog at the time, so you can check out my blog on my Vakil GitHub.io site. I wrote an article, Outreachy, What, How, Why. So if you're curious about Outreachy or similar programs like Google Summer of Code, Season of Docs, or just getting started in open source in general, check out a little bit about my experience. I wrote more about my journey there, and some other experiences I had during my internship. And so, in addition to keeping in mind that failure can be your friend, I want to underscore a point that several of the speakers have already made today and yesterday, which is that if you want doors to open for you, it's really important for you to be open with yourself, right? For you to be doing things in the open, having conversations, building connections, talking about what you're interested in, asking questions, being out there, putting yourself out there. And one amazing way to open yourself up, especially if you're starting out in your tech career, is by learning in public. So, one of the most amazing speakers, oh no, the title is too small, but Gift Egwenu. Y'all know Gift? Yeah, shout out to Gift. Gift, we miss you. So Gift gave an amazing talk at CodeLand Conf last year. You can find it on the YouTube channel for Code Newbie at CodeLand, about learning in public and about how when you open up your experiences, your challenges, the things you're struggling to understand, the aha moments that you have, the small learning gains that you make. When you do that in public and make it open, whether you're writing blog posts, or you're giving talks, or you're making YouTube videos, or you're having conversations with people in the hallway, whatever it is, opening yourself up and learning in public is an amazing accelerator for opening those doors for your career. So go check out Gift's talk, it's really great, and she also gives some great resources there, you can go read more. Okay, so now let's say you've successfully got your foot in the door of the tech industry, and now you're working at a company, or you founded your own company. Now it's time to open some doors for your company, which means making money, am I right? Business is business. So, what about the impact of open source at work? Raise your hand if you write open source software as part of your job. Anybody? Yes? Okay, we got a couple of hands, Okay, what about if you use open source software at work? A lot more hands, right? So if your company, even if they aren't producing their own open source projects, odds are that they are using open source projects? It's hard to find the exact statistic, but I've read that anywhere from about 85 to 95% of businesses rely on open source as part of their software work. So that means that there is a market in open source, right? Open source can make money. So there are so many success stories of open source focused companies like Red Hat, like MongoDB, Elastic, MuleSoft, getting acquired or going public for billions and billions and billions of dollars. $1 billion, anyway. And they have been so successful all based on open source technology. It used to be a couple decades ago, people thought there was no money in it. That has been proven false, right? So how does this work? How do companies make money off of open source? Well, when development happens on an open source project, that means that it's out there. Other developers can use it. They can try it out. They don't have to purchase free trials or subscriptions or anything like that. So they try it out and they love it, right? Developers start to really drive adoption. They love these libraries, they love the tools, the open source frameworks, languages, all kinds of stuff. And as developers adopt more and more of these technologies, that means the companies that they work at also adopt those technologies, and so it starts to make money for the businesses that are using or creating, supporting these open source projects. But the thing is, if we just stop there, and if we just say, okay, at my company, we're using open source, and it's making us money, and great, that sort of puts a ceiling on the doors that we can open, on the opportunities that a company can have. Whereas, if we invest back into those open source projects, into the communities that are building those open source tools, maintaining those open source tools, then we get this positive feedback effect, right? Where we have better tools, we have more adoption, we have more opportunities for the business, which can then reinvest in the tools, and more adoption and more opportunities, and so on and so forth. So it creates this upward spiral of opportunity. And so that's what my company, the company I work for, Hasura, we build an open source product. So Hasura lets you put instant GraphQL APIs on top of your data. So you give it a database, and it says, poof, auto-magically, here is a GraphQL API you can use to query and mutate that data. And so that is all driven by an open source project called the Hasura GraphQL engine. You can find it on GitHub, and there's a lot of other open source projects in Hasura's GitHub repository. And so this means that there's a whole bunch of people who can open issues, file bugs, make contributions, right? And contribute back to this open source tool, which developers can also go use for free. And then that tool, because it is a GraphQL engine, is based on another open source technology, GraphQL, and it's written in another open source technology, the programming language Haskell, functional programming language. Anybody use GraphQL in the audience? Yes? Okay, a few hands. What about Haskell? Any Haskell developers out there? Yes! All right. So these are two really big open source projects that are kind of fundamental to building useful tools like this GraphQL engine that Hasura builds. And so that means that it is to Hasura's advantage, and it is really important for us as a company to reinvest in those communities. So there are a couple of blog posts, several blog posts on the Hasura.io blog that you can read more about if you're curious about how they support and sponsor open source development on projects like GraphQL and Haskell, because as those systems get better, as those tools get more efficient, as they get fewer bugs, as they have more features, that means that Hasura as a company can do more, right? And by reinvesting, again, we get that positive feedback loop. But of course, as we all know, open source does not stop with code, right? I've been talking a lot about the coding side of things, the code base, but there is so much more to open source, right? Like documentation. Who was at Tejas' talk yesterday? Yeah? About documentation changing the game? Yes, so awesome. So similarly to documentation, which again we open source in GitHub, Hasura also has some really great free and open source tutorials on topics like GraphQL, databases, front-end clients for GraphQL, things like that. And so these are all in GitHub repositories. And so they're right on the site. Sorry, the font is a bit small, but basically they are all totally free and open source, and they're maintained by the community. So we have like 150 plus contributors contributing back to this documentation and to these learning tutorials, which means they get better for everybody. So I don't know if you can see this, but anytime you're reading a course on Hasura's Learn site, so for example, this is the Intro to GraphQL course, which you can find at hasura.io/learn. You'll see a little button. It's hard to read, but it says Edit on GitHub. That means that if you're reading the tutorial, and just like Teja showed us yesterday, there's something that doesn't make sense, or something that could be explained better, or a typo, or something that's just plain wrong, or a question you have, you can just instantly click through to GitHub, file an issue, make a pull request, fix that typo, ask that question. And that means that the community can keep making the learning experience better for the next people who come along and take the course. So it's like, once you've gone through the door, you can hold it open for other people to come through behind you. And that means that we get this, again, a positive feedback cycle, where you can't really see this, but the tutorials have been translated by the community from English, the original language they were written into other languages like Chinese, Japanese, and any other languages the community wants to contribute translations to. So that means even more people can learn. And that means even more people can help contribute to making the tutorials better, or maybe adding new tutorials. And this is where that positive feedback cycle happens, because now we're not just talking about a company pushing out documentation and pushing out learning materials in a one-directional flow. We're talking about a community building things together, right? And that's really where the galaxy brain insight comes in, right? Because it's cool to build software. It's even cooler, right, to build open source software, right? But the really expanding thing that helps explode the growth of the software industry and the opportunities that companies have in that space is building a community around that software and an ecosystem around that software, because then you have the positive feedback effect, right? Which is why we're here, because it's all about the community, right? So that is the last point I want to leave us with today. How can we open more doors for the community, for each other, for our other friends that aren't in the community yet? How can we create more opportunities for the whole community? Has anybody read the GitHub Octaverse reports, the state of the Octaverse? A few people? Okay, if you are interested in open source and you use GitHub, or even if you don't use GitHub, you should check out octaverse.github.com. They put out this really great report based on a survey they do of open source developers on GitHub. And so in this year, in 2021's report, they found, first of all, there are 73 million, over 73 million developers just on GitHub. And we know there's more open source than there is on GitHub, right? So that's just a small portion. 73 million developers. And, exciting statistic, 16 million of those are new users in 2021. What does that mean? That means almost 20%, about 20%, or like 1 in 5 developers on GitHub, developers, documentarians, technical writers, designers, everybody involved in open source, 1 in 5 is new. That's amazing. That means the community is exploding, right? Which means we have even more new people in the community, which means, as we've been talking about here and at the Sustain event, was anybody at Sustain the other day? Yes, okay, awesome. So we're talking about supporting sustainable communities. So GitHub has a special sub-report on supporting sustainable communities, and they call out a few key points that you should keep in mind if you want to support sustainable communities in open source. So let's take a look at a few of those. So the first thing they point out is that mentorship is a community asset in both open source and inside of companies. So it's all about having a person there, right? Those connections, like Dom was saying, having a person you can ask questions, you can go to for advice, you can just complain to when your code's not compiling, right? It's all about having someone who you can ask one-on-one. That really helps communities thrive. So we've already talked about Outreachy, which you can read more about at outreachy.org. So Outreachy internships are mentored. My mentor, Maya Friedrichowski, amazing mentor. She was so helpful to me. She was an Outreachy intern herself before. She had a mentor also at Mozilla. And so it's like this beautiful pass it forward chain, right? You can become a mentor as well as be a mentee. So if you're interested in doing an Outreachy internship, or if you run an open source project and you're interested in sponsoring mentorships and taking on mentees, check out outreachy.org. And of course, there are other programs like Summer of Code, Season of Docs, etc., that have similar approaches. Another program I just heard about recently through my friend Tejas and his company Zara is an initiative called Tupu, which is a mentorship network that helps women and people of color and LGBTQ folks advance in the tech industry and become more included in the tech industry through mentorship. So you can sign up to be a mentor, you can sign up to get a mentor, and by doing that, you can do both, and by doing that, and whether it's through an initiative like that, or maybe it's just in your local community, maybe it's at a meetup, maybe it's someone you met here that you're DMing with on Twitter, whatever it is, if you can put yourself out there and say, hey, let's talk one-on-one, let's help each other out, that is what it takes for this community to become sustainable and have that explosive growth, and for us all to have better open source software to work with. So you can check out some of those resources, and let's move on to the next point, which is that in order for communities to be sustainable, we have to have trust and respect, because those contribute to a strong culture. Trust and respect within the community is essential. Has anybody heard of the Contributor Covenant? Like maybe one hand or two? Okay, so the Contributor Covenant is a really cool document. It's essentially a document that's open source itself that you can use in your open source project or community to set a code of conduct for everyone who is contributing or being part of that community. So that means it's like an agreement that we all make to be respectful of each other, to be welcoming to new people, to be taking a respectful and trusting approach when we're interacting with each other, so that we're not saying things like, ugh, you don't belong here, or ugh, that PR was terrible, ugh. No, we want to be respectful. We want to make sure that we're mindful of the fact that people come from all different perspectives and have all different experiences, and that everyone should be welcome. So if you run an open source project, I would strongly recommend checking out contributorcovenant.org and taking a look at this document. It's something you can include in your repository so that everyone knows what the guidelines are for creating a trusting, respectful environment, so that everyone feels safe to ask questions and make contributions that make the project better. And similarly, the third point we're going to talk about, the last point I want to talk about from the GitHub Octoverse report, is that safe and welcoming communities attract newcomers and encourage more contributions. So if you want your project to be successful, or if there's a project out there that you contribute to that you want to be more successful, it's important to make that community and that project safe and welcoming to newcomers. Because we saw 1 in 5 people on GitHub is new. That's amazing. Let's make them feel welcome. So I just found out through Twitter about a really cool document called the Open Gates Checklist, which is a checklist of things you can keep in mind. It's intended for dev content creators, but I think it definitely applies to open source maintainers and anybody who puts anything out there into the world of open source, that is intended to stop gatekeeping. So instead of keeping people out and saying, you're not experienced enough for this, you don't know enough Haskell for this, you don't know how to fix the Linux kernel, or you don't belong here because of where you're from or how you look or how you talk or any of that. We don't want to do any of that anymore. There's no point. So this is a nice checklist that you can read through to make sure that you're using inclusive language, that you're thinking about accessibility, that you're thinking about different perspectives. Because that's the thing, gatekeeping in open source, we are done with it, right? So what I want us to think about going forward is not just how we can stop gatekeeping, but how we can take those gates and just destroy them entirely. You know? Let's just take them down. Let's do gate breaking instead of gatekeeping. Because that's what it's all about, and that's why we're here, right? Because we are making this community happen, and thank you so much. Huge round of applause for the organizers of OSCA, Sustain Africa, all the other communities, right? She Code Africa, all the other, One Laptop, the Laptops for Devs, all of these communities these organizers are working so hard to create inclusion and welcoming. And do you feel welcome? I do. Yes, yes. So thank you so much for having me. And please, let's keep on opening those doors for ourselves, for our companies, and most importantly, for each other, right? Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.